We all love a good first, right? Like the first woman astronaut, the first person of color to win an award. It's exciting. But for me, I always wonder, what happens after that, after the fanfare? How does that first change things for everyone else?
Right, like what's the lasting impact?
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, the evolving story of Indian Americans in U.S. politics.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and before you think, politics, not my thing, trust me, this is about way more than just elections. This is about immigration, social mobility, stereotypes, all those juicy
The
topics.
kind of stuff that really makes you think, huh?
Totally. And what's fascinating is how fast this story is unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you consider that, historically speaking, Indian Americans are relatively new to the U.S. compared to other immigrant groups.
It's true. I mean, did you know they just became the largest Asian American group in the U.S. this year?
Wow, this year.
2023. Talk about a major shift. And it makes you think about how different things were just a few decades ago.
A completely different world. Think back to the early 20th century. You have a largely marginalized group facing intense discrimination. Imagine, just imagine being told you couldn't own land just because of your heritage.
It's hard to even fathom that kind of prejudice.
It really highlights how recently things have shifted, though, right?
Absolutely. So to really get this, we need to rewind, go back to the very beginning. And for Indian Americans in U.S. Congress, that story starts with a lettuce farmer named Dalip Singh Saund.
And not just any farmer. This one had a PhD in mathematics.
Okay, see, now that's a detail I knew you'd love. Talk about an interesting path to Congress. This was 1956. Saund had already faced decades of, frankly, just systemic discrimination. He couldn't even become a U.S. citizen for the longest time because of his race, let alone even think about running for office.
And that's what makes his story so powerful. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was challenging a system that was designed to hold him and so many others back. You know, the source mentions Sikh farmers who were forced into these awful labor jobs, denied basic rights. Saund's journey to Congress, it offered this glimmer of hope at a time when opportunities seemed incredibly limited.
Yeah, and it's amazing he even got elected, considering the time.
It's almost unbelievable, right? His campaign strategy involved downplaying his Indian heritage. He went by D.S. Saund just to appeal to a wider, let's face it, more prejudiced electorate.
Wow, that's a tough pill to swallow. It reminds me of how Barack Obama's name was used against him during his campaign. Some things never seem to change.
It's disheartening for sure.
So Saund achieves this incredible victory. The source calls it a democratic miracle, but here's the thing. It took decades for another Indian American to reach Congress after him. Decades.
Wow. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And that brings us to a very different chapter in our story and our next case study. Bobby Jindal.
Okay, Jindal.
Fast forward to 2007, and you have Jindal, the first Indian American governor elected in Louisiana. Talk about a complete 180 from Saund's story. This wasn't a farmer battling discrimination. This was, as the source puts it, the immigrant America wanted.
Yeah, he seemed to fit the mold.
Exactly. Ivy League education, a Rhodes Scholar, successful career. Jindal seemed to embody, at least on the surface, the American dream.
Although, as we often find, the full story is a little more complex.
Isn't it always? So how did Jindal rise through the ranks so quickly? What were those stepping stones?
Well, the source uses a great phrase to describe his story. They call it breadcrumbs that help understand Indian American politicians from his generation. He was ambitious, for sure, politically savvy, and he was willing to play the game.
But even if it meant taking on roles he wasn't quite qualified for, like that whole stint as health secretary at 24 with zero experience.
Exactly. And that pattern continued throughout his career. This drive to prove himself, to climb the ladder, even if it meant, well, distancing himself from his heritage in a way.
Almost like he had something to prove.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting, right? This idea of shrinking yourself to fit in,
Yeah.
even when you're achieving these amazing things.
Right, exactly.
It's complicated. And it gets even more interesting when you consider Jindal's whole thing with the new model minority idea.
Let's pause there for a second because I'm not sure everyone's up on that term. Can you break that down for us?
Sure, yeah. So the model minority myth, it basically suggests that certain minority groups, in this case Asian Americans, have somehow overcome all these historical disadvantages they faced just through, you know, hard work and determination. And they're held up as like the poster children for successful assimilation. But here's the problem.
Yeah.
It often ignores the very real challenges that many within those groups are still facing. And it puts this pressure on them to conform to this very narrow definition of what success looks like.
It's like saying, look, they made it, so everyone else should be able to. It erases so much of the struggle.
Exactly.
And it ignores all those systemic barriers that are still very much in place.
Absolutely.
And in Jindal's case, it seems extra ironic
Yeah.
because he's being held up as this model, and yet at the same time, he's downplaying his Indian heritage. He even converted to Christianity.
Totally. And you can imagine that didn't sit well with everyone in the Indian American community, particularly, those from Hindu backgrounds.
Right.
Some people saw it as like he was turning his back on his roots, which kind of added to this feeling of like this disconnect between his public persona and, his background.
It's almost like he was trying to fit into this tiny box of what's considered acceptable instead of pushing back and saying, hey, this is what an Indian American politician can look like.
Exactly. And that brings us to this very important question about the current generation of Indian American politicians. Have they managed to break free from that mold, or are they still operating within those same boundaries?
Okay, so let's ditch the history lesson and jump to the present. What does the current landscape of Indian American political representation really look like these days?
Well, one thing's for sure, it's definitely a lot more crowded than it used to be.
Right.
It's not just a handful of figures anymore. There's this whole new wave of Indian American politicians making their mark.
Yeah, and one of the biggest changes the source highlights is the names. We're not talking about D.S. Saund or going by Bobby instead of Piyush anymore. You've got people like Pramila Jayapal in Washington owning their full names. No apologies needed.
It's a small change, but it's so significant.
It is.
I think it points to this growing sense of confidence. It's like, this is me, this is my name, take it or leave it.
I love that. It's about owning your identity and demanding respect for who you are, full stop.
Exactly. But, it's not like these politicians don't face any pressure. It's just, well, the pressures are different.
Oh, I'm sure they're out there.
The source points out that a lot of these newer politicians represent these diverse, affluent districts. It feeds into that whole spelling bee champion stereotype.
Right. It's like, we'll accept your difference, we'll celebrate it even, but only within these very specific parameters.
Exactly. And many of them do kind of fit that mold of the technocrat. Doctors, lawyers, tech executives turned politicians.
Which, on the one hand, it makes sense, right? Indian Americans have really excelled in these fields, and it speaks to, the incredible talent and drive within the community. But, and I think there's a but here, right?
There's always a but.
It also brings up some important questions about what representation actually means. Are we really seeing this broad range of experiences and perspectives reflected in government? Or is this just a new kind of tokenism?
It's a really good question.
It's like we're stuck in this loop where we celebrate the achievements of those who've managed to succeed within the existing system. But what about all the people who get left behind? What about all those stories that aren't being told?
Absolutely.
And that makes me think about something the source said about representation in Congress. Did you know that there are actually no Indian American military veterans or union organizers in Congress?
Really? I did not know that.
Which is fascinating, right? Because these are groups that are often representing, working class interests.
For sure.
So even though we are seeing more Indian American faces in these positions of power, they're often coming from very particular backgrounds representing very specific segments of society. So it's like, yes, it's amazing to see more Indian Americans in these roles, but it's also critical to ask, does this actually represent true, meaningful representation? Or are we witnessing this new, more subtle form of tokenism that's celebrating success within the system, but not really changing the system itself? It's like we're focused on winning the game without ever questioning if the game is rigged in the first place.
That's a really good way of putting it.
And it brings us back to that big question. Is this real change? Or are we just rearranging things on the surface while the same problems simmer underneath?
It really is the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no simple answer.
I get it.
But one thing's for sure, this isn't just about Indian Americans.
Right. It's so much bigger than that.
This is about the challenges ANY democracy faces. How do we make sure our leaders actually reflect the incredible diversity of their constituents?
Exactly. And I'm not just talking about checking boxes on a census form, but really representing different experiences, different backgrounds, different values.
Absolutely. Because representation without real change, it's just window dressing.
Just for show.
We need people in power who are willing to fight for those who've never had a seat at the table, who truly understand what it means to face those systemic barriers we've been talking about.
Yes, because they've lived it.
And it's on us as engaged citizens to hold our leaders accountable, right? To push them to do better, to demand more than just, surface level representation.
Because real change, meaningful change, it requires more than just words.
We need action.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final big question for you listening out there.
Oh, I like where this is going.
What does authentic representation really mean to you?
What a question.
Is it about hitting certain numbers? Or is it something much deeper, something that actually shifts the power dynamic, something that amplifies the voices of those who've been silenced for far too long?
It makes you think about the kind of future we're building.
And what kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. Because the story of Indian Americans in U.S. politics, it's still being written.
And we all have a hand in writing those next chapters.
So what will your chapter say?
What a powerful thought to end on. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those very questions.
Till next time.
Keep asking those tough questions, keep pushing for change, and as always, happy deep diving.